There was a participant from a listening session in Maine who said something along the lines of, look, our institutions are broken. They're not responsive. They're dysfunctional. And as a result, who wants to participate in them? We don't participate in organizations that might pull us into connection, because why bother? And when that happens, you end up not having a culture of connection to your cultural civic life, sort of also degrades. He said, we end up in this vicious cycle. He says, isn't the goal, we need to be in a virtuous cycle. We need to be in a virtuous cycle. And he was right. And what did he mean when he said we needed to be in a virtuous cycle? He was sharing the idea that any healthy constitutional democracy depends on political institutions that empower people, that deliver equality of voice, that are responsive. And then it depends as well on a civil society and civil society organizations that pull people into participation and also help them bridge social differences and give them an information ecosystem that empowers them to participate effectively in our civic life. And as people start to participate in civil society as a part of linking back up to participating in our political institutions, you also need to nourish the roots of a civic culture of mutual commitment to one another and of commitment to our constitutional democracy, a recognition that democracy is a team activity. It is about problem solving together, even though we have massive and serious disagreements. So that's the virtuous circle that we need for a healthy democracy: healthy institutions, a civil society that helps people bridge differences, and a civic culture that nourishes a sense of mutual commitment of all of us to one another. So as we worked on our report, we therefore sought to sketch out strategies of response and specific solutions that would do all three of those things. So there's no silver bullet to solving the problems of polarization or inequality that we currently experience in our democracy. Instead, we have to work on all three of these dimensions at the same time. So I want to give you just a few examples of some of the recommendations that we made and think out loud with you about how they contribute across all three of those dimensions. So under the category of empowering voters achieving equality of representation, we are recommending that we increase the size of Congress, all right? We recommend an increase by at least 50 seats, or a target of around 500 being reasonable, but it could go higher than that. The British Parliament and the German legislature are both bigger than our Congress. Our Congress was capped artificially by legislation in the 1920s as a part of a fight over the census. And it wasn't supposed to be capped. When the Constitution was first designed, the size of the House of Representatives was supposed to grow steadily with the population. So we need to return to that notion that the House, the size of the House, adjusts with our population. The result of having capped the size of the House is that now votes in California, for example, have a lot less weight than a vote in Wyoming. There's a real imbalance between the more populous and the less populous parts of the country. Importantly, it's not just that there's this sort of imbalance in representation in Congress, but that imbalance flows through to the Electoral College. After all, the Electoral College consists of a combination of electors that number the same number of the members of the House plus the number of the members of the Senate put together, right? That's how we get the Electoral College. So when we capped Congress in its size, we also put a dynamic in place whereby over time, as the country became more urbanized and as populations balance shifted from rural to urban contexts, we had a problematic shift in the weighting of the Electoral College. The Electoral College was designed to protect the smaller, less populous states in the Union, for sure. That's the job it had to do. But it was doing that job with a very delicate weighting. And the capping of Congress has meant that the protection afforded to less populous states has simply grown in scale. This leaves us now in a position where it's a reasonably probable likelihood that we can see a split between the popular vote in an election for president and the Electoral College vote. Now, routine, repeated splits between those kinds of votes will simply undermine the legitimacy of our institutions. It's okay if such a split is a rare probability event, a low probability event, but it's not okay if it's a higher probability event. So the time has come really to address this issue and to find a way to rebalance the Electoral College. And the way to do that is by permitting Congress to grow again, as was originally intended. So that is an example of a highly impactful change that requires nothing more than congressional legislation to achieve. The good news about such a change is it's not actually clear up front which party would benefit from such a change. So that means there is a space for bipartisan collaboration around an idea of that kind. And indeed, I didn't mention this about our commission, the 35 of us who worked on this report, but we spanned the ideological spectrum. We spanned geographies, we spanned demographies, we spanned academic disciplines and also professional sectors. So the recommendations that we produced really did come from a cross-ideological consensus. Now, it's a good thing to change institutions in that way, but at the same time that we're doing that work, we need to make sure those institutions are, again, connected to a healthy civil society and to a healthy civic culture. So as if we could have a bigger house and have improved voice, improved representation there, we also want to make sure that as we are working our way through political issues and debating political issues, we're doing that in a healthy media environment with healthy information ecosystems. One of the features of the current structure of our democratic life has been a great erosion of local news. Very little coverage of city governments, very little coverage of state houses and state governments. And the reason for this is because of the huge growth of social media companies. And so one of the things we advocate is the use of a tax on the targeted advertising revenue on media platforms to fund a public investment in local journalism, local investigative journalism. The argument is that the large social media corporations should help support the necessary democratic functions that they have actually displaced. And a well-informed public with full access to full range of news is a really important part of ensuring that the kind of representation that we're trying to achieve in Congress can function in a healthy way. In the third category of culture, there are a number of different investments. We think it's important for us all to spend time working on the question of how we narrate our shared history. But another key argument is that we should invest again in civic education, in equipping all young people and making opportunities of lifelong learning available, but equipping people with the knowledge and skills and dispositions needed for effective civic participation. In World War II, this country understood itself to be in a scientific competition. As the war was unfolding, it was clear that the Germans were seeking to build an atom bomb in order to shift the balance of power in the war. And as a result of this, here in the US, we initiated something called the Manhattan Project. James Bryant Conant, who's then president of Harvard, secured massive federal government investment in the project and knit together research universities around the country to beat the Germans in the production of the bomb. They succeeded, they won, they did it. And that was the moment at which the federal government began investing seriously in sciences in our research universities. Those investments were followed in the Eisenhower years in response to the Soviet Union's launch of the first satellite into space, Sputnik. The concern, again, was that the US was going to fall behind in a global competition for security if we didn't invest in scientific knowledge and learning. So we made those investments. They were important and critical. And that approach continued over time. In the 80s, the concern was that we needed to achieve economic security and economic competitiveness in a global context. And again, the argument was that in order to achieve competitiveness in the economic sense, we needed to invest in STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. And we made those investments. The result of making those investments is that we now find ourselves in a position where every year we're investing about $50 per kid of federal monies in STEM education and 5 cents per kid of federal monies in civic education. So you get what you pay for, and we have not been investing in civic education over the last 3 or 4 decades. This is something that we definitely need to rectify. the goal in achieving or pursuing competitiveness on a global stage is not to compete as any random country. We are trying to compete as a constitutional democracy. To do that, to be safe and secure in a global context, we need to really ensure that we have civic strength at home. And that civic strength is about the citizenry knowing how to use political institutions effectively, but it's also about our understanding how to bridge divides, how to find our way off battlegrounds and back to common ground. And civic education is not the only answer, but it's an important part of the answer for rebuilding our civic strength and ensuring that as we start to try to redesign our institutions, we can populate them with people who are committed to working together effectively and have a depth of knowledge about our history and our institutions in order to govern effectively. We've seen some of the breakdowns of governance in the past year through the pandemic as we've been struck by the complexity of our federalist system and have had difficulty figuring out how to operate it in order to deliver for ourselves the safety and security that we needed in response to COVID. We don't need to be ill-equipped with regard to understanding our system. Federalism provides great virtues, great benefits, and we can use it effectively to harmonize our effort and govern for the public good, for the common good. But in order to do that, we actually have to rebuild our understanding of the basic machinery, sort of needing to get out that user's manual and make sure that across our society, we have a deep understanding and acculturation in the best uses and best approaches to the machinery that we've built. So it's work across these dimensions. Again, redesigning our institutions so that they are actually, from a matter of the incentives they create for office holders, working to our benefit, but also investing in civil society. Again, for example, with the media corporations, such that the ecosystem of information in which we are all operating is healthy and supports our healthy participation in politics, and reinforcing constantly a healthy civic culture through civic education.